Oh, so we never talked about moving the aggregate supply curve.
No.
Oops, sorry. We need to go back to that. So a lot of these will look very similar because really this is the differences between aggregate supply and regular supply are not all that different, okay? So the number one non-price determinant of aggregate supply are resource costs or resource prices. And again, you need to think of this in the macro level, not the micro level. Right, so the idea here would be along the lines of things that every business has to pay for costing more. So like every business pretty much needs to use electricity, right? So when the cost of electricity goes up, everybody has to pay more, aggregate supply goes down. And again, please remember that higher costs lead to a decrease in supply, right? So this is actually one of those inverse type relationships, right? Where the more it costs, the less you supply.
That'd be like a minimum wage increase.
Exactly, right? So if minimum wages went up, again, it's kind of affecting every business because technically, does every business have a minimum wage employee?
Well, they have.
Maybe.
No, waitresses aren't minimum wage.
Right, but I mean, think about a technology industry, right? I mean, if there's a tech company out there with like 20 employees, are they paying any of them minimum wage? Probably not. Even the office manager isn't going to pay minimum wage. I mean, maybe if they hired a clerical person part-time-ish. I mean, maybe. So in theory, but that would be something else that would be, say, a resource cost for all businesses, okay? That's also why gasoline is considered a resource cost for all businesses, because what do most businesses have to do? They have to either travel or ship their goods, right? So if yeah, I mean, they're going to pay their people to travel, right? So that's the same sort of business. So gasoline is often considered a non-price determinant for aggregate supply, but not necessarily for the supply of other goods, right? And that's becoming less and less true, though, because a lot of times businesses now, tech businesses, they don't ship anything, right? They get a file over the internet, they fix the file, and they ship the file back over the internet. There was no traveling, right? So again, though, resource costs are the number one ones. The other classic one that tends to drive aggregate supply is this technology. And again, technology will always increase supply. That's always the way it works. And this technology is really, again, just look for the word. I will always use the word technology somewhere in there. So if I tell you there's a new technology that makes, blah, 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 the key word is always technology, okay? The idea here is that the biggest technology increase that we've seen in the last 30 years, of course, is the computer, right? I mean, if you think about the Ronald Reagan years and the Bill Clinton years, those were the years where aggregate supply was booming because it was so much easier to do business, right? Now, that didn't necessarily mean that there were more jobs for people, right? I mean, think about what the computer did. It did make doing work easier, but did it make us hire more people? No. I mean, think about the old accounting firms, right? The old accounting firms where everything was done in a big, huge ledger, and people had to write in the ledger, and then people had to check the ledger, and they had, I mean, how many accountants were being hired to make sure all the numbers were entered into the proper book and in the proper column, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I mean, if you were an accounting firm with 200 or 300 different customers, you probably had 500-600 accountants working the books because they had to manually enter everything in. Once a computer came around and all you had to do was type a number into a form and that automatically threw it into a spreadsheet in all the right columns automatically, how many accountants did they need after that? Yeah, probably only even one. 3, one to do it, one to stand around and watch him do it, and one to check it, right? I mean,
and the IT person.
Oh yeah, true. That's the idea, though. So realize that technology, it will increase aggregate supply, but don't assume that it's increasing jobs necessarily. It usually does, but yeah. All right, so resource cost, technology. What normally followed this on our old supply line back in chapter 3 and 4? Never hurts to review, folks. Never hurts to review.
Resource prices, number of sellers?
Number of sellers, in aggregate supply, that pretty much stays fixed, right?
Future price expectations?
Taxes and subsidies. All right, now, here we're worrying about businesses everywhere. When we were talking about taxes back in the micro world, we're talking about taxes on the product. Now we're talking about different kinds of taxes. Corporate taxes, as opposed to actual individual item taxes.
Oh, they pay those?
In theory, they do. All right. And again, this is the sort of thing that affects aggregate supply. So if you hear that the government is increasing corporate taxes, the idea is that what's that going to do to aggregate supply? Yeah. So more taxes, folks. Remember, taxes are a bad thing, right? So this is another one of those inverse things. And since it's such a big deal, we separate taxes and subsidies at the aggregate supply level. So technically they get a separate line. Normally I used to write those together, but the book for the last 2 editions has been separating them like they're a big different thing, and I'm okay, whatever. So I'm doing it the same way the book does. So I'm trying to be more consistent.
Does that increase?
Yes, this one, if you get subsidies, remember that's where the government's paying the business to do business, right? I.e. bailing them out when think Ford, well not Ford, but GM and Chrysler, right? The government came in and subsidized them for a little while to make sure that they didn't fold. And then the other thing that goes hand in hand with taxes that businesses complain about are regulations, right? So it means it's the 2 things that businesses always bitch about: the fact that they have to pay tax, follow rules. Right, yeah. And again, remember that this is another one of those inverse relationships. If you have more regulations on business, it does make them supply less, right? So, and this is again why businesses are often saying, well, if the EPA would just go to hell, we'd be able to produce more because we would have less regulations, and less regulations leads to more supply. Minor detail, whether somebody dies or not. I mean, come on. All right. So again, most of these are going to be available to you all the time, anyways. All right. When you take the final, since I have to give you the non-price determinants of regular demand and regular supply, please note that they essentially carry over to the aggregate supply ones. But I'm not going to write these down. And did I already erase it? I did.
Oh, so you're not going to help us out?
Not on this one. Nope, folks. You got to keep them separate, right? I'm not going to write these things down. You have to know them this time. Okay? And the reason why is that you should really know what affects the macroeconomy supply level anyways. Okay? So that's why I kind of want you to memorize these this time around. Okay. So let's try another one then. So, what does I stand for? Business investment. So it's essentially business spending, think. All right, so assume we are just recovering, if I can't spell that word, just recovering from a recession. Okay, so see, that they should, right? When we're recovering from a recession, it's good. And you read that the government is cutting spending to balance the budget, which if you have listened to the news a little bit, this is definitely something that the government has been talking about, right? And if you think about our current state of our economy, where are we? We're recovering from a recession, slowly but surely, right? So, here we go. Again, when you draw your aggregate supply and aggregate demand, please draw aggregate supply first. It will just make your life easier, okay? So remember, Keynes, intermediate, classical. And where am I going to put aggregate demand? Towards the bottom of the I stage, right? So, I mean, you could put it square in the middle too if you wanted to, but whatever. So, you've set yourself the table. Now you have to tell me what happens to aggregate demand and or aggregate supply. So, government is cutting spending. Where does that fit in?
Well, is it corporate taxes?
Did I say up there that I'm charging taxes for businesses more?
It's in the government.
G. What does G stand for? Government spending. What's cutting up there? Government spending. So, government spending falls. What does that lead to? A decrease in aggregate demand. So aggregate demand will decrease. When aggregate demand decreases, which way do I shift it? To the left. Here's your new aggregate demand curve. And if you moved it far enough such that it made it into the Keynesian range, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, if you think that the government is going to cut spending by, say, trillions of dollars next year, aggregate demand will probably fall back into the Keynesian range, folks. If we really and truly balance the budget next year, we would go into a recession, period. I mean, if the government had to cut over $1 trillion of spending, I'm almost assured that I will lose my job because they won't be able to afford me teaching anymore. I mean, I'm too expensive. Okay? So I like to draw it where it doesn't move as far so that I get to keep my job. All right. The fact remains, though, what happened? Let's look at the good stuff first because we always like to be smiley first, right? So what happened to prices? They fell, right? Isn't that nice? Right? What happened to CPI? It went down. Awesome. So the first thing we're going to say is that CPI will fall, so prices will be lower. Woohoo! No? No. Why is it bad? Oh, nuts. Right? Here's where GDP was. Here's where GDP is. What happened to the economy? Economic growth slows. GDP falls. And what goes along with lower GDP, folks? Except what do we care about? Lower employment. Or you could say more unemployment, whichever one you like better. And the goal behind this, right, is that you should be analyzing what your elected officials are saying. Because if they say we need to balance the budget, which means cut spending, they are basically saying we need to lower GDP. Which, I mean, maybe we do. I don't know. Who am I to judge? But the nice part about it, folks, is that it will stabilize prices, right? So the real economic argument for the reason why we need to have a cut in government spending is not to balance the budget. Balancing the budget is a magician's way of saying that, you know, everything is okay, right? The reason that we want to have GDP fall in this particular case or have aggregate demand decline is because we're expecting there to be high inflation sometime in the near future, and we want to cut it off before it happens. So we're nervous about higher prices, and that's why we are cutting government spending. Now, an added side benefit would be that maybe we can balance the budget someday, but the real economic argument should be stable prices, right? That's right. So whenever a politician says that I'm cutting government spending to save your children, yeah, I mean, that's the biggest load of bahooey that ever existed, right? That's known as a normative argument. There isn't a whole lot of fact behind that. It's purely heartstring playing, okay? So, I mean, it's not a bad argument to use if you're an elected official, but, you know, if you're going to be an economist, the reason that you want the government to cut spending is so that prices don't soar, because that's what we care about, right? Again, if GDP happens to fall in the process, we'll be sad, but, you know, that's the price we're willing to pay to keep prices stable. That's the idea behind it, at least. All right? All right, so, not bad? All right. So let's try another one. All right, so assume we are in recovery, but not quite at full employment. You hear about a new technology that makes buying goods and services easier. And let's call it, you know, an iPad or an iPhone or a smartphone or a smart anything. Nice thing about smart anythings, right, is that they make buying things easier, right, because you can just hop on your little tablet anytime you need to and say, look up, well, where are they selling shoes cheapest? And all I got to do is that once I find the cheapest one, hit the buy button, and it will buy it for me. Isn't that nice? Yes. Okay, so CPI, GDP. Here's our aggregate supply. Where am I going to draw aggregate demand? Closer to the C, right? We've been recovering for a while, but we're not quite at full employment. In order to be in C, you have to be at full employment. So yeah, we'll put aggregate demand somewhere over here. So we're having some inflation. The economy's humming along fairly well. It's recovering fairly well. So we're getting some CPI being a little bit higher than normal. But the nice part about it is that GDP is cranked way up there, right? So everybody's got a job, or most everybody's got a job who needs one or wants one. And the economy is happy. All right, so now you hear about this new technology that makes buying goods and services easier. So what do you expect to have happen? Exactly. So technology equals increase aggregate supply. Now, when you increase aggregate supply, my advice for you to increasing it is to shift it to the right, which is what you want to do. The way you do it is shift the Biebers. So here's where your Biebers are, the points, right? So the idea is that you want to shift these points to the right. So shift this point out here, and shift this point out here. So just shift the point by, then do good old dot to dot, okay? Because when you shift this Keynesian region, what happens to it? It's not, you're not going to tilt it all. Don't tilt it, okay? Keynes never tilts. He's straight, narrow. He's an Englishman. He was really boring. It's probably one of the most boring lectures you've ever heard. There's a recording of Keynes lecturing to the School of Business in London. Oh, God. I'd have fallen asleep in his class. All right, so here is now your new aggregate supply curve. Right, so just move this to the right and that to the right. Technically, this moves, but you don't really see it moving much, right? It's kind of weird, but that's the way it works. All right, so here's where we were. Here's where we are. Okay. So we're in black. Where we are in red. What happened to prices? New technology, generally, folks, it makes prices lower. All right? The reason that it makes prices lower is that businesses don't have to spend money doing other things, right? So if they can just give you a little application that says push a button, they don't have to spend thousands of dollars advertising to you on television or other media in order to do it. They just have to buy a little app that says, ooh, if you buy the Starbucks app, you'll know how to get to a Starbucks anytime you need to, right? And there's obviously one within every 5 miles of where you're at, so yes. And what Starbucks will be able to do, since they don't have to, advertise on television or during the Super Bowl anymore, they can lower the price of coffee. I mean, theoretically. I've never seen them do it either, but that's the concept, right? So we expect CPI to fall, which is, again, a bonus. We like that, right? And what happens to GDP? Ooh, right? We're buying more stuff. If we're buying more stuff, what's going on? Right? That means they got to make more stuff. So GDP is going to be on the rise. What's happening to employment? You might think that really new technology is going to lead to more unemployment. It may in the short run, but in the long run, it will actually lead to better employment. The idea, of course, is that Starbucks will now need to hire, 15 or 20, instead of advertisers, they'll have to hire 15 or 20 IT people, right, who can fill out applications and send them out to the internet so that they can then be purchased, etc. And, right, essentially utilize the new technology that's working. So note, this is the holy grail, the true holy grail of the economy, right? Because what happened to prices? They actually fell. And what happened to GDP and employment? They both went up. This is what the 1980s was all about, folks, right? When computers first started working for business. Right? Computers were good for other things initially. Government work, not what you were thinking. True. But anyways, shifting aggregate supply to the right. Again, shift the whole line, but notice that Keynes tends to be its happy little same self for the most part. All right? Yeah, those things always go together. Remember that they do tend to lag. Right, remember that the unemployment rate itself is actually a lagging indicator. So when GDP rises, we don't expect unemployment to fall right away, but eventually it will. That's the idea. Right? If you can get GDP to start climbing, the circle, instead of going down, is now going back up. And so eventually those businesses will have enough more money that they can actually hire people instead of just whipping the people into working 60-hour weeks. All right. Yeah, we're fine. I was teaching this class Monday night. It was a 3-hour class. Started at 5. And for some reason, I thought it started at 5:30. Well, I actually finished what I thought was really early. It was like quarter to 8. And I was like, see, I got done early. And they're like, yeah, wow, 5 minutes. I'm like, no, 45. Oh, whoops. I sort of felt bad. Because I told them they were going to get out early, and early meant 5 minutes. That was early, right? All right, so, okay, so we are at full employment. The economy is booming. And you read that exports from the U.S. are increasing. So we have recovered from the recession. This is like 2 or 3 years down the line, folks. We finally get, quote-unquote, fully recovered from this, quote-unquote, Great Recession, whatever that is. And now the U.S. is humming along. The rest of the world, though, they're kind of hurting. They all want to be the United States, and so they say the way we're going to do it is we're going to buy things from them, right? So if we don't have full employment in India or China or Japan or whatever other country we're talking about, they keep looking at the U.S. going, oh, if we could just move to the United States, we would get a job and be making tons of money and be wealthy beyond our wildest dreams. And so they get on the internet and they buy a Starbucks coffee. It costs them $30 or whatever. Well, no, there's a Starbucks everywhere in the world, too. Who am I kidding? Or they buy American trinkets, right? And so we start cranking out more American trinkets because we've all got a job and we're making American trinkets, you know, like American flag pins or something, or you know, really cute snowman coffee mugs, and the people in China think that that's awesome because it represents the United States. Go U.S. Right? Okay. So, I want to know what happens to the economy. Go up there and show me.
Do it! You can do it, man. Extra credit for you.
That's right.
I believe in you.
So what do you do first? Good idea. What is that? Oh, okay. You better label it. Good idea.
Lines are getting smaller. I love it.
All right. What does the K, the I, and the C stand for again? Keynesian Intermediate Classical. Very good. You got to put aggregate demand in there first. Where is aggregate demand? And why did you put it there?
Because we're at full employment.
Full employment, and full employment means you're in the classical range. Excellent. Okay.
Exports are increasing, so aggregate supply would increase.
What are exports? Non-price determinant of what? Look on your paper. What are the non-price determinants of supply?
Resource costs, technology, corporate tax, subsidies, regulations. So
Are exports anywhere in there? No.
no,
So where are exports?
aggregate demand.
Aggregate demand. Ah.
Exports,
Exports. What's the? Is it a plus or a minus sign in front of exports?
minus. So
Wait, what has a minus in front of it? Imports have the minus, right? Exports actually have a plus. So that means that when we have more exports, what happens to aggregate demand? Amen. Write that up there. So start with that. Aggregate demand increases from more exports. Yep. Now tell me about the three different economic indicators for the macroeconomy. What are the three goals of the macroeconomy? Stable prices. So what happened to CPI? Where was I? You were here. Where am I? CPI went up. You better write that down. Is that good or bad, Matt? Bad, yeah. Prices are not stable. This sucks. What happened to GDP? So GDP stays the same. So is that good or bad? Well, I mean, it's not good, but is it necessarily bad? Yeah, it stayed the same, right? Since it stayed the same, it was like, oh, okay. Yeah. Right? So what happened to employment? Stayed the same. All right, so give me an overall feel for the economy. What would more exports do for us when we're humming along at full employment?
Crap and nuggets.
Yeah, it actually is bad, right? When you're at full employment, you don't want aggregate demand to grow anymore because all that happened when we get a growth in aggregate demand, prices go up, all right? So normally when the economy is in this full employment range, is the government trying to pump the economy? No, it's actually doing the exact opposite. It's trying to rein it in, right? So that's why sometimes the government actually should cut spending, right? Remember that G is one of these aggregate demand pieces as well. So when the economy is at full employment, the government, they cut spending because they're actually trying to cut back on the amount of demand that's going on in the overall economy. Because they know that more demand just going to create more inflation. And that would suck. All right? Nicely done, Matt. All right, so that's another great example for why growing aggregate demand is not always what you want, right? Granted, it's been, a while since we've had that happen in the economy, but sometimes it would be nice, right, to have full employment be an issue, right? All you young people don't remember the 90s. This was the 90s, folks. It was great to be working in the 90s, right? All right, so let's see. How about one more? Or better yet, let's revisit reasons for inflation. So if you look back to your chapter 13 notes, what were the two reasons we got inflation? What caused them? Question 6 on the quiz you just took.
Rise in general prices.
And what was that called? Inflation. Cost push, right? Cost push inflation. And the demand pull inflation. So these are the two ways that we got inflation, right? It was either because of a cost push move or a demand pull, right? And this one was resource costs rising. And this one from too much demand or too much money chasing too few goods, right? That's the colloquial way of saying too much demand. Colloquial, of course, meaning fancy. It's a fancy way of saying fancy. That's what colloquial is. All right, so my question to you is, now we know how inflation occurs. We see CPI rising, okay? So for these two examples, let's assume, for simplicity's sake, we are in the intermediate stage. right? These two stages, Keynesian and classical, they're really unique stages that really don't happen all that often in the new economy. New economy being from the 1940s on. Prior to the 1930s, folks, all economists thought aggregate supply was this straight up and down line. Seriously, that was the only economic theory that existed. I'll explain that at the beginning of class next week, but it's sort of cool. Well, hopefully you'll potentially believe my hand waving, but that's literally what all economists used to think. All right, so cost push inflation. So I'm going to make the Keynesian range really small, if you don't mind, because really all I care about is the intermediate stage.
And what is that line?
That's aggregate supply.
You didn't write it.
I'm working on it. I was going to give somebody a chance for extra credit, but now I'm not. All right, so when resource costs rise, what happens? You guys now know, right? Resource costs are a non-price determinant of supply, right? This leads to supply decreasing. All right, so when supply decreases, again, remember to move the Bieber points to the left because we're decreasing this time. So here is one point, move it to the left. Here's the other point, move it to the left. Please note it stays on the same line. It looks weird, but this is really how you do it. Here's our new aggregate supply curve. All right, now, here's where we were. Here's where we are. All right. What happened to CPI? Went up, right? I mean, because we said there was inflation, so CPI better go up. It'd be silly if it didn't, right? Right. So here we see CPI goes up or inflation, which is exactly what we expected. Now, what also comes along with that inflation? What happens to GDP? Uh-oh. GDP falls. And what would fall with it? Employment. So here, this is the double whammy, right? When we saw aggregate supply growing, that was sort of like the holy grail, right? Because prices fell and GDP rose. When aggregate supply falls, prices go up and GDP goes down. The wrong thing. This is exactly what every president dreads, aggregate supply going up. Imagine you are President Jimmy Carter back in the 70s, and the price of gasoline triples under your watch. What happened to aggregate supply when that happened? We saw huge inflation. Inflation was up in the double digits for the first time in 30 years, and GDP fell. And so what happened to Jimmy Carter when he went up for election again? Yeah, bye-bye. So this is actually a special type of economy that we call stagflation. Yeah, stagflation's nasty crap, man. When this is going on in the economy, it's the amalgamation of two words. It's stagnation or stagnant economy and inflation. Hence, stagflation. This is the sort of thing that I guarantee you get somebody else elected, right? So inflation with stagnation, bad, right? So cost push inflation is one of the things that economies dread to no end, okay? Now on the demand pull side, what's happening when we have too much demand? Sort of a giveaway, right? Aggregate demand increases. So when we shift aggregate demand to the right, Here's our new aggregate demand. What happened to prices? Here's our old. Here's our new. So yes, CPI went up because we said there was inflation, so duh. CPI increases, hence inflation. But what comes along with this inflation? Yes, the nice part about this GDP actually grows, right? So here, GDP rises, which is actually a good thing. So demand pull inflation is actually not considered all that bad in the economy. It's a little scary because we're getting inflation, but at least everybody's either getting their job or getting promoted or whatever. They're getting more money, getting more pay. It's just causing some inflation in the process. Right? And generally speaking, when economists are looking at this Great Recession, what they're looking for a true recovery to have happened is to have some of this, right? Until we start seeing some inflation, economists aren't going to think the economy has truly recovered, right? They're really looking for it. They're saying that's the true sign, right? And the idea, again, is that that's when you guys refuse the minimum wage job and, finally get the job that pays you what you deserve, whatever that is. Pick your favorite number.
$4 million.
Reasonable, right?
So what are you going to do with it? Because you'll always want for stuff.
Of course, right. Well, I mean, that's the way it works, though. All right, so this is Chapter 14. Questions? All righty, so the homework. Two, 4, 8, and 10. Page 390, is that what it is? What? 309 and 310?
376.
Okay, 309 to 310, just so you know what page you're on. You will please note that there is an appendix to Chapter 14. The appendix that follows Chapter 14 talks about what classical economists used to think the economy worked like. So that's what we're going to start class with next week is the appendix, and then we'll move on into. All righty? All right, get out of here then.
You want to know why I don't like this class? Because I used to be an informed voter, and now I'm an educated informed voter, and it's just really...
Makes voting more painful.
Yes. It's like, ugh, angry all day. What's that?
I don't like either one of you.
But see, here's the thing about not voting.
Yeah, then you can't.
Then you can't bitch about it. You didn't vote. It's like, you have no
You don't
opinion.
count. You don't count.
You might as well be one of those not counted unemployed people. Some didn't do
You-
it.
You're a discouraged voter. You got all this? Okay.
I'm discouraged because I still got one.
I'm gonna write a book called Unintimidated. That's not Oh Lord, let's please not talk about
You could like write a spoof on it and make it intimidating.
this. So,